Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, the Unjerked podcast is just for this week only affiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is,
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
and we basically take online circle jerks and look at them from a more data driven lens. So, this is part 2 of our episode about democracy and ways to reform democracy. Voter suppression. It's an unfortunate reality that voter suppression exists, even in the U.S. is, probably a silly thing to say because for most of U.S. history, entire racial group had their vote suppressed. So it's actually quite a common thing in the U.S.
Sad history here, but it's the truth.
Yeah. So how does it happen? We don't have a lot of. It used to be, poll taxes and literacy tests and stuff. Those are all illegal now. But there's still things that basically lead to voter suppression. I think one thing making voter access difficult is one thing. Like, you have to vote in person. There's, way fewer voting locations where all the poor people live, stuff like that. And then the other is gerrymandering. So basically, if you have congressional district maps, you can basically move around the borders of the districts. And even though the actual total vote is the same, you can have different outcomes based off of that. And so there's, essentially there's different ways you can do this. Let's say one block of voters is like 30% of the electorate. But if you disperse them completely, so that they're 30% of every single district, then they don't have a majority in any districts, and then they have zero vote. Or the opposite also has a similar effect where you put all of those people in one single district. But the point is, like, if there's an intelligent way of districting, it actually takes a fair amount of careful thought about, like, okay, this voting block is 30% of the electorate. How do we shape the electoral districts such that they end up being represented by 30% of the representatives? It actually takes a lot of thinking. So there's a couple of solutions. So one is proportional voting, which we'll get into more later. The other is independent redistricting. So the Brennan Center talks about proportional representation. So basically, we'll talk about this more later in detail. But basically, proportional voting. So in the U.S., we have single winner districts. We have majority single winner districts. So every district is represented by one person, one congressman. In proportional voting, a district is represented by multiple people, and who gets picked is a percentage of who gets, which party gets elected. So let's say let's say in the state of Colorado, 20% of votes go to one party, 50% to another, 30% to another. Then they're going to divide the members of Congress in direct proportion to those votes. So 20% of the congressmen from Colorado will be from Party A, 50% from Party B, 30% from Party C. And so this basically makes it a lot more difficult to do gerrymandering. You could still do some gerrymandering because you'll still have some, because some countries, like I think in the Netherlands, maybe not, but I think in some countries, they don't have districts at all. They'll just say okay, we're doing proportional voting for the entire country. So if 30%, let's say 30% of the votes go to the Democrats, then 30% of the parliament will go to Democrats, or whatever party. And 60% goes to the purple party, then 60% will go to the purple party. The issue with doing it for the whole nation is that a lot of people feel like, there's regional needs. My region of the country has needs and values that are different from the rest. So we want special representation, keeping that in mind. So you do need to have usually you want to have some geographic districting, right? And so, you have to kind of pick a good combination of the two.
Maybe we can make a no weird shapes rule, squares only.
Perhaps. But I think a good, an idea I'm throwing out is what if each state had the same number of congressmen as now, but it was entirely proportional. So we're going to vote, because right now senators are at large, because we have 2 senators for each state, but they're voted at large by the entire state. So if we did proportional, where it's like we're going to have 9 congressmen from this state, and they're going to be in proportion to the party votes. So that's one way to deal with gerrymandering. The other is independent redistricting. So the Harvard Kennedy School has an article about this. Basically, the idea is, in a lot of states, the legislature draws the maps. And that is just the ultimate conflict of interest, because the people whose jobs, the people who decides how the people get elected are the people who have been elected previously. So the incentive is like, how do we draw the line so we stay in power? It's just a huge conflict of interest. And so in a lot of, in some other states, you either have an independent board that makes those decisions, or you have some sort of judicial, review process where the Supreme Court of the state reviews the redistricting and decides whether it's fair or not. But the idea of the actual state house deciding where the lines are drawn is just a massive conflict of interest, because the people who are already in power are going to do what they can to make sure the lines keep themselves in power. So there's a couple other solutions to reduce voter suppression. So one is mandatory elections. So Australia famously has mandatory elections. There's a Stanford News article that talks about it at length. But basically, it forces people to pay attention. I mean, you can still vote like no or nobody on the ballot, but the point is, a lot of people, I think the very act of being forced to go to a voting booth, I think will force people to actually pay more attention.
It also feels simultaneously super pro and anti-American.
It does. That's a good point.
Because voting is very American, but being forced to do anything is very anti-American.
But if you're forced to vote as a citizen, that kind of automatically fixes voter suppression. Because it's like, well, you're going to vote, so do it, Election day holidays. So for
I'm a fan of that one.
So elections are usually on Tuesdays, right, in the U.S.?
Yeah, they usually are.
Something like that. But it's like, why would you have an election on a weekday? It makes no sense. So I would say make it a holiday so everyone gets the day off. More poll locations, mail-in ballots. So the election lab at MIT talks about this. Mail-in ballots have been shown to not, despite what some people say, there's no evidence that it leads to widespread fraud. More poll locations would also be good. So more accessibility, early voting. There's a lot of ways you can expand the number of voters. And if you're worried that your political party will lose power if more people vote, then maybe you should think hard about whether or not your political party actually represents the people of this country. Just putting that out there.
What are you saying there?
I'm just saying, if more people voting makes you upset, what does that say about whether or not you're actually a representative, way of thinking in the country? So the spoiler effect, we'll go more into this later. There's a lot of interesting electoral systems that fix the spoiler effect. Voting for emotion and symbolism. So we'll talk about this later. There's separating the head of government and head of state, and then balancing democracy and technocracy. So there's not a lot of research on this. I think it's just about using your judgment. So state house.
What does that one mean? Technocracy versus democracy?
Like a technocrat. If you're the assistant deputy of the EPA, you're not elected directly by the people, because the people, as a general rule, the populace doesn't know a lot about very niche, environmental protection laws or whatever.
No, they just want someone to get it done, but they're not going
to
pick out an expert.
So none of the cabinet, none of the government agencies, nobody in the executive branch is elected other than the president and the vice president. Everybody else in the executive branch is appointed by the sort of higher level positions are appointed by the president and then confirmed by Congress. And then the lower level positions are chosen by the people who were appointed. So when you're talking about like specific officers within the military, like none of, except for the generals, none of them are appointed or confirmed even by Congress. They're chosen through a system of bureaucracy. So, the Senate in the US used to be elected by the state houses in the US. So they were actually more accurately considered representatives of state governments. They were not directly elected by the people, but then there was an amendment that changed that. And so, is having the Senate chosen by the state legislatures versus the people, is one better than the other? I mean, there's room for debate as far as that goes. There's things like referendums, which are basically when people, the legislature proposes a law and then the people decide. Initiatives are when the people write the law in the first place and then the people decide. Then there's recalls where someone is removed from power based off a vote of the people. So those are kind of the most extreme versions of democracy: referendums, initiatives, and recalls.
Oh, the ones where everyone votes on everything, and then you get all the commercials. Don't know on Prop 8 or I'll be homeless.
Yeah, so you see a lot more propositions on the West Coast. You see
I've noticed.
Prop this, prop that. You don't really see that on the East Coast as much. I think it's overall a good thing. Sometimes you have sort of interesting outcomes, like there's one proposition in California that limits the growth of the property taxes. Property taxes can only grow by X amount. And so you have this situation where there's houses that were built in like the 70s that basically have an effective property tax rate of like 0.001% or something ridiculous, because now it's worth like $2 million, but it was initially worth like $50,000. And so these like millionaire landowners are only paying like $100 a year in like property tax. So that's like a completely dumb law that exists because of like a proposition or whatever. And then I think
why I bet there's more referendums on the West Coast is I bet the West Coast is more of a yes vote area, while some of the older East Coast states are probably more no vote states, like where people generally vote no unless they're convinced otherwise.
Perhaps,
so if you want to get anything done, you just have to like kind of do it under the radar.
Yeah. I get the vibe that East Coast states tend to have more corruption in politics. Like if you're talking like the New York political machine or the New Jersey political machine, like I feel like that you don't see that to the same effect in the West Coast, or to the same extent. I don't know. Anyways,
is it like more old wealth or something?
Yeah. It just seems like there's entrenched kind of political machines that exist, out east. But you hear a lot more about like bribery, scandals and stuff like that. Or like, Chicago is kind of notorious for that as well. I feel like the West Coast is more just like people tend to have more extreme political opinions. Anyways, the media environment. So I didn't do enough research about this, but there is a big debate about like, should there be impartiality codes? There used to be a thing called the fairness doctrine that said you had to like present both sides of an argument on public airwaves. Some people say that's, against freedom of speech. It's like, hey, I own this radio station. I should be able to say whatever I want. Is there something like that for the internet? I
was wondering about that with social media, because depending on what echo chamber you live in, you're probably mostly getting all of the information from one side, because that like hooks you in, and what information you get from your opposing view is probably just there to get you angry, to keep you on social media. So I wonder if there's like an application of the fairness law for that.
So my understanding, so I've been listening to a lot of podcasts talking about the TikTok ban, the potential ban, and people are talking a lot about the context around that. And so Rupert Murdoch is from Australia, And apparently, when he wanted to buy his first newspapers in the U.S., he was basically told he had to get a U.S. citizenship because apparently there's
Yes, I
laws.
heard all about that and how we used to like make sure any broadcast agency had to be American,
Yeah,
which
so
social medias kind of are because that's where most people get their news.
yeah, so it seems like broadcast newspapers and TV stations, there seems to be some sort of law that requires American ownership. How do you apply that in the context of social media? Because it's not the actual websites, it's not Meta, it's not Twitter that's creating the content. It's users. So how does that work? And then is it practical? If a social media website was required to be owned by people native to a country, well then like Europe would basically have no social media because like none of those companies are owned by Europeans. I mean, I guess like a small percentage perhaps of the shares, but practically speaking, they're all American companies or Chinese companies. So how do you manage that? It's a difficult thing to suss out, but it's something that needs to be talked about for sure.
How
So,
does the
anyways,
BBC get away with it?
well, the BBC is get away with what?
Oh, well, I guess we get them, but it's not really broadcast on our airways.
Well, they do. So I think a lot of. So I don't think the BBC's government owned. They have a special agreement where you're required to pay a license, a TV license as a British subject, and that money goes to the BBC. But I don't know if they're actually government owned or not. Because I know NPR is not. So NPR gets some money from the government, but it's technically a nonprofit. It's technically not owned by the government.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good question. And then yeah, so I mean, you can have like on YouTube, you have like I mean, I don't know if RT is still on YouTube, but it used to be, and RT is Russian state media. And
Mm-hmm.
so, there's a disclaimer. I think there should at least be a disclaimer if something is foreign owned. If something is owned, because Al Jazeera's, I think, owned by the Qatari government. So, it seems reasonable to like put that disclaimer.
Yeah,
Um,
something like that.
yeah. So next we'll talk about governmental systems. So there's actually a lot of different ways you can categorize this. You can talk about separation of powers between the branches. You can talk about elite versus public control.
Oh, wait. I gotta go over my Reddit internet
Oh,
arguments.
okay.
Okay. Well, to quote, who was the cult guy in Oregon that was just like the problem
Oh,
with
Osho.
democracy? Osho, the Osho quote: "The problem with democracy is the voters are idiots or stupid." I can't remember what he said,
Yeah.
but that's I think like most of the other problems people bring up fundamentally with democracy is like you can very easily manipulate the public
Well,
and
that's
people are
why,
just
like,
not very well informed.
I think the flip side to this is like if you have a dictatorship, like, it's not like the revolution was led by like the most well-informed scientists or whatever. It's usually like a bunch of thugs with guns who take over.
Yeah.
So the same problem exists in dictatorships. I think the best way to solve this is to vote for people who, because I don't think politicians should be experts in anything. They should be experts in legislating and managing coalitions and understanding the mandate of the people and, those types of things and understanding like, how do we find the right experts to advise us in these areas? So I think if voters focus on like which politicians are the most ethical, have the best, um, you know, have the best character, have the best leadership skills, have the most experience in certain areas, I think that's a way you can still have a good government. But I do agree. I mean, it gets tough when it comes, even when it comes to a lot of policies. I think people should be educated more. But at the same time, there's just so many different policy areas that like nobody can become smart about all of them. So I think when you vote for people, you should really focus on character and leadership skills.
I definitely agree with that. That and like being able to put a team together, because like at the end of the day, you're not really voting for Trump or Biden. You're voting for their cabinet
and
and
the
them.
and the biggest thing, and this ties into one of your other comments about the primary selection is rigged or whatever. No good
Oh yeah,
choices.
that's the next
Yeah.
bullet we have written down. Which I mean that's a big thing that people bring up, like why we don't really consider Russia a democracy is. I mean they jailed and the one contender, or the one competition, Navalny, against Putin, and he died in jail. Like, if you have a democracy that tries to jail its like opponent candidates, or really limit your primary system, then like is it really democracy, or are you just like kind of staging the choice so that the voters pick what the establishment wants
So I think
anyway?
the difference is in Russia they use the security apparatus to basically remove the choice. In the US, the choice, the reason we have not great choices sometimes is the pipeline is not being managed by the voters. So the pipeline, when you actually,
I think it's primarily, well, it's a little bit of that, but I think it's mostly the spoiler effect, which I saw that
spoiler
we're
effect
really
is
going to talk
big.
about that a lot. But I think that's the biggest issue,
It's the
because
biggest, I think.
I don't think, I'm unconvinced that it's not like voter run, because I don't think Donald Trump would have ever won that first primary if it wasn't voter run. You could make, there's a lot of people that make that argument though for the Democratic primary though, because of well, people are just really butthurt about Bernie never winning the primary.
Right, but so in the 2024 primaries, which are done by now, which is
Yeah,
crazy, but
they have enough
but
delegates. It's
like
basically
each
done.
but like Trump and Biden both won their primaries handily.
Yeah,
Trump was running towards the end. Trump was running against Nikki Haley, and um, I mean, he, in terms of the primary voters in the Republican primary, like he handily won. And the same
yeah,
with Biden. Like they had the sort of no. There was Dean Phillips. There was a couple other people, and then there was the big uncommitted movement because of the Gaza situation.
hmm
Biden still
which I
won
think it
very
had some effect, because they're really pushing for that ceasefire now.
true. But the
Yeah,
point is, like both primaries, the candidates won very handily. But now people in the general election are saying, "Oh, the choices are awful." So that's okay. Well, why is that? So I'm sure. So part of that, a big part of that's the spoiler effect. I also think the pipeline. So when you actually look at like, okay, where do politicians come from? If you actually look at like, there's 400 and whatever members of Congress. There's a president, vice president. There's 50 governors. How do they end up in those positions? Look at their career paths. It's pretty standard. You see a lot of commonalities. So obviously, the president, vice president, it's usually people who were governor, senator, whatever.
usually.
When it comes to like who becomes a governor, who becomes a senator, who becomes a congressman, it's two types of people. It's either someone who started out at very low levels of politics. We're talking like city hall, staffer for some congressperson, someone who someone who worked on a campaign for the election of the governor of whatever. So a good chunk of them started at the very very bottom of the political system, local level staff, etc. And then the other group of people is basically people who lateraled into politics from the business world. People who like, oh, I was a big real estate developer in my state, and so I decided to run for governor, that type of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and you know when it comes to the former, especially, I mean, that's where our choices come from. And if you don't pay attention to those lower level elections, then you're not going to get people you want at the higher levels. And so, when you look at mayoral elections, the participation rate in the vote is like 10%. It's just this abyss. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know who my mayor was until like I was 29 years old. It's just something I never really paid attention to.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a thing. It's like how do you fix that structurally? It's like people just don't care about local elections. They just don't.
I don't know how you get people to care more about the lower level stuff. How many people in the pipelines who higher levels of government just start complaining about how it's all rigged and nothing's right. The guy at the top's not doing it right. And he starts complaining about it at a bar, and then he starts making speeches at larger and larger political events until eventually he's elected.
He started at a beer hall.
He starts at a bar. He's just complaining to his buddies,
like a beer hall.
Yeah, he's at a beer hall
in Munich.
Yeah, and people just go like, "Oh yeah, that's awful. Keep going."
I was trying to
making a Hitler joke. No, I'm just imagining like the montage of someone's like, "It's just not right. Well, you should run." I'm like, I think I know.
That's kind of what AOC did, if you think about it.
Yeah, isn't that what Warren did too?
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren was a professor, I think.
Yeah,
and most of the, especially the people who rise up from the bottom, a huge chunk of those are former lawyers.
Big time.
Like I think like 40% of congressmen.
That kind of makes sense that you would want a background in law before you are all about making laws. I mean, especially if you're a congressman.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So most politicians, they're lawyers or they're businessmen. I mean, that's kind of what you get. Any more of these you want to read out?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the primary system is a big one. And I've always liked your critique about how there's not a good mechanism for bringing up better people or just, slowly bringing up the good people of character from the bottom. So the next one that I have heard a lot, and this is I think this is the big argument, like outside of America, like from like Russia and China and stuff like that, is democracy is bad for long-term planning because your plan can change from election cycle to election cycle, or say, oh, you have this alliance now with this leader, but if your leader changes every so many years, how can we trust that you will honor your elite or agreement?
I think you can fix a lot of that by moving a lot of wonky decisions into sort of the administrative state, the so-called deep state. So anyways,
I think the deep state feels like a neural network, like a lot's going on back there, and you don't really want to look too hard on it. It's not very transparent. You can't quite explain it, but it works better than anything else.
I mean, there's ways like for example, leaving an alliance will make it so that 2/3 of Congress has to approve before you leave an alliance. Like, there's ways you can fix those problems without like becoming a dictatorship. You mentioned democracy is slow. I mean, that is true.
Yeah, we mentioned that it is slow, but I think that's the point of having an executive power.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is like, you don't really have to do any fundamental change if all you have to do is look like you did the right thing. And I think this might be like a criticism for, say, I don't know, like environmental reform. Like, all you have to do is look like you're doing a lot of work, but you don't have to like actually do it because you just need the voters to believe that you did the job.
Yeah. So anyways, those are a few of the
one
criticisms.
And then a couple others. This is a really important one to me. If you're elected by the people, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the mandate of heaven. And then finally, there's the dictator speech from Sacha Baron Cohen's, which I'm including that because the idea behind the speech is he starts. This is at the end of the movie The Dictator, where Sacha Baron Cohen plays some dictator from whatever country.
Would
I Widya. But the joke is that, oh, you guys trash our dictatorships all that much, but think about how awesome it would be if you were a dictatorship. And then he starts listing a bunch of like corrupt things that American democracy does, like, oh, you could give tax breaks to all your rich friends, things like that. And the joke there, or turn that joke into a point, is a lot of people feel that, no matter the mechanism, you end up getting the same outcome.
Yeah, I think I mean the stats we discussed earlier kind of disprove that. Obviously bad things happen under democracies, but it's not even a comparison when you look at dictatorships, and the results. So that's that. All right, that was part 2 of our episode. We're going to go to part 3 next.